So my name's Jamie Angus. I'm the editor of the Today programme on Radio 4, and I've been the editor here for about 18 months, and I worked on the programme for a long time as a producer. So I joined the programme in 1999, and I worked here for about 8 years as a producer before leaving and doing other things in the BBC, and then I became editor about 18 months ago. Today is the most important news programme that the BBC produces. It's certainly one of the largest radio audiences of any news programme that the BBC makes, and it's very much the focal point for national debate, particularly around politics and the state of the economy and domestic stories, and also the best international coverage. So we're one of the biggest breakfast radio programmes in the UK, as well as being the shop window, if you like, for the best BBC journalism. The Radio 4 audience is older than you might imagine, so the average age of our audience is 54, but that's actually younger than most Radio 4 programmes, so we have the youngest average audience of any Radio 4 programme. The Radio 4 audience are aspirational, they're curious about the world, they like to be challenged and stimulated intellectually by discussion and compelling content about the most important news stories. They like to engage with our presenter team, who are the most important part of the programme, so our 5 presenters, who they feel over time they build up a relationship with because they've been listening to the programme in many cases for 20, 40 years. So I always have to remember that while I'm trying to attract younger audiences, in the case of Radio 4, younger means 35 to 54. We're trying to attract younger audiences, but I've also got to make sure that my core heartland audience is happy. The main editorial meeting for the first main editorial meeting is about 11:30, so we usually spend an hour then kicking around ideas, deciding what roughly we think the main programme leads are going to be the next morning, where we're going to focus most of our energies on the production team. Then we revise that again at about 4:15 in the afternoon. We have a sort of shorter sort of revision meeting where we say what's going well, what's going badly. We usually junk a lot of stuff then, put a lot of news stories in the mix. The producers who are here during the day hand over to the night team at about 8 o'clock. So a fresh team come on, fresh set of legs. They start at 8 o'clock at night and they go right the way through until the programme goes out, until the programme's off air at 9:30 the following morning. So that's a very long shift. It's a very exciting shift, because it's the one where you actually put the programme to air, and people really enjoy to do that. So for me, I usually go home about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But then I'm on the phone a lot in the evening, so I'll read the handover, I'll be reading the wires, I'll be reading social media, I'll watch the news, I'll watch Channel 4 News, I'll watch the 10 o'clock news, I'll watch Newsnight, I'll then phone the night editor, possibly several times during the course of the evening, just to kind of go through what we're doing, how we're pitching particular interviews, to prepare the presenter briefs for the interviews, so that I've talked through the main editorial lines we're trying to get to. And then I usually go to bed at about 11 o'clock at night, and I get up just before 5, and then I come back into work for the programme. So I usually get here just after 6, so just after the programme has gone on air, and obviously I then want to be here for as much of the time as the programme is on air, and we very much change things during the course of the programme. So it's very rare for us not to change a single thing between going on air and coming off air. I felt that I picked up a lot of experience in all different parts of news, both international and domestic, and in TV and in radio. And I wanted to kind of bring that to bear on a programme that I really loved. So when the job came up, I applied for the editor's job, and that I was appointed about 2 years ago. It's really interesting because I've worked for BBC World News, a continuous news station, and I'd worked for Newsnight, which is a sort of fixed point programme, and I love doing TV. I love working with TV, and it has immense power. It has huge power to move through pictures, the sort of interface of talk and pictures, and that's an incredibly powerful, sophisticated tool for telling stories, for storytelling on air. It is also immensely frustrating. It's hugely time-consuming, very resource-intensive, very expensive. Things you want to do, you just can't, because you can't get the graphics you need, or you haven't got pictures to write to. and that is frustrating. So it's frustrating and rewarding. And one of the great pleasures about doing radio is the directness and simplicity of radio. So it needs to be done well. It can be done in a sophisticated, hopefully, way. But it's a very direct experience producing radio. Frankly, if you want to cover a breaking news story anywhere in the world, as long as you can get somebody on the end of a telephone, you can tell the story, and often very vividly, actually. So the simplicity of making radio means that you can spend a lot more time thinking about ideas and doing the journalism, and there's just much less of the production side and cost. So it's very simple, it's very direct, it has an enormous intimacy and power with its audiences. So the process of listening to a radio programme is so intimate. You really feel, audiences say they feel as if someone's in the room talking to them. They have a very direct and personal relationship with the voice that's speaking from the radio. And that's a hugely powerful way of telling stories, of getting audiences interested in often quite complex issues. So those are the kinds of things I love, and of course it has its frustrations as well. Well, I suppose in the ways that I've said, it's simpler. It can be tricky when you've got a really picture-led story. So if you're doing a story, so just look at the news last night. There's a really strong picture-led story about the plane crash in Taiwan. So a plane comes across the motorway. You see the plane striking a taxi and bouncing off the bridge and falling into a river. And it's a really, an incredible story. It's not a great radio story because once you've described what happened, you've really run out of things to say. And so it's very interesting. Sometimes stories just don't translate well on radio. So it's a challenge, and sometimes stories like that can be frustrating because you think we're stuck on a really big story that isn't a natural fit for radio. But that's all part of our challenge to try and work out intelligent, smart ways of doing that for radio better. My personal feeling is that one of the great things about living in Britain, in my private view, is that Britain is a very tolerant and pluralistic society, and it's particularly tolerant and pluralistic in the question of freedom of religion, freedom of expression with relation to religion. There's a great tradition in this country of being tolerant of all faiths and none. And again, my personal view is that Thought for the Day is actually a really important pillar that supports that structure. So people don't really think very much consciously about why Britain is that way, which I think is a positive feature of Britain and our national life. And I don't, it sounds a bit immodest, but I actually believe this is true. I think the fact that on a radio programme that's heard by 7 million people every week, the fact that faith has its own regular slot and that a faith-based way of seeing some topical news stories is a regular feature on the programme, I think is a hugely important part of the way our audience think about the world. Albeit loads of them don't like it, but at one level I think it's really important. So that's why I've always said I think it's an important part of the programme that it's here to stay, even though whenever you start being the editor of the Today programme, the first thing people say is, are you going to get rid of Thought for the Day? I would say the most important thing is do something else as well. So I think it's quite hard to go straight into a journalism career from a journalism qualification, for example. So I think everyone is really well advised to do other things either first or simultaneously because it'll make you a better journalist. So for me, I worked for a political party for a couple of years. I found that really useful. It just gave me a lot of useful background and knowledge about things that I then went on to cover as a journalist. So I think if people are interested in careers in the media, it's really sensible to think about the media very, very widely, because you can see the kind of, if you look at the value of big media companies, if you look at what's happening with Sky or BT, who are now become massive media production house, that those companies are here to stay. They're going to require huge amounts of trained staff, journalists, writers, technical staff, management support staff kind of going forward into the future alongside the BBC and ITV and local newspapers. And if you look right across the waterfront, there's a lot of work there. But if people narrow down too closely what they're prepared to do or willing to do in the first instance, I think that can make it harder to get your first job when you try and get into the industry.